So what exactly was the Renaissance? Leonardo, Michelangelo, Donatello, Raphael, and some other guys, right? Well, let's explore. The Renaissance was a truly groundbreaking and revolutionary period in Europe that went on roughly between 1300 and 1600. As with every great moment in history, the Renaissance was also driven by man's search for meaning. After the fall of Rome, Europe descended into the Dark Ages. The Carolingian Empire stabilized things to a certain extent, but Europe was under siege by Muslims from the south, by the Vikings from the north, and by migrant horse archer civilizations from the east. The eastern part of the Roman Empire survived, but it was also under constant siege by Persians, Arabs, and Turkic tribes. By the 11th century, Europe began to stabilize. The Muslim invasion of Iberia was halted, the Vikings were Christianized, Europe's eastern border was guarded by Hungarians and Poles, and the Crusades and the Norman invasion of southern Italy threw back the Muslims in the south. This geopolitical safe space and such factors as the warming of the climate and emerging forms of capitalism in Italy and the Low Countries led to an unprecedented growth in population. By the year 1300, Europe was in a golden age. International trade flourished and universities and Gothic cathedrals were springing up left and right. Society all throughout Europe was organized on feudalist lines, but something very unusual was on the way in the north of Italy. The Holy Roman Empire, the rightful ruler of these lands, was long gone. The Italian city-states had won their independence and were now governed by petty despots or assemblies of oligarchs. These new rulers were essentially middle class, merchants, moneylenders, and leaders of the guilds. This was highly abnormal for the times. Under the system of feudalism, the king and his nobility would rule the land. They dispensed justice and fought off the invader. The clergy, the second class, would administer to culture and spirituality, while the third class of society, the peasantry, would do all the labor. This system might have been seen as unfair by the peasantry. However, in reality, no class was overprivileged or underprivileged in any fundamental way. Wars and large-scale banditry were everyday occurrences and problems for the nobility to solve, and the maintenance of knowledge and the consolation of medieval man's soul were also Herculean tasks. In feudalism, every person had his or her designated spot within society, with every role having a proportional set of privileges and responsibilities. The new men, the middle classes, were radical mavericks in this society. With international trade and an increasing monetization of the economy, some who were not members of the ruling classes amassed such fortunes that rivaled that of dukes or bishops. These middle-class people were certainly very privileged, however they did not share the proportional responsibility that would have come with the rank. The instinctual hostility of the nobility and the clergy to these new men ensured that they would not be fully integrated into society until the 16th century. Nonetheless, in northern Italy, they were already in charge. These new men were illegitimate rulers of constantly feuding small polities, always in fear of mercenary condottieri, populist demagogues, and members of their own family. In this dog-eat-dog world, every prince and every oligarch needed to constantly signal his legitimacy. One way of doing this was through art and scholarship. Being an author, an artist, or a university lecturer was becoming very lucrative as each city-state vied to outcompete the other. Such men as Giotto, Dante, and Petrarch were the early beneficiaries of this newfound patronage. They were the early humanists. Humanists, similarly to earlier intellectuals, drew their inspiration from the classics of antiquity. The technological superiority of Rome and Greece was already widely recognized and widely discussed at the universities of medieval Europe. What made the Italian humanists different was their preoccupation with the humanities, such as history, literature, languages, grammar, rhetoric, and moral philosophy. Humanists continued to recognize the material superiority of the ancients, while also insisting that antiquity was morally superior to their current times. Indeed, the expression Middle Ages was invented by the humanists. Before the Renaissance, scholars divided history into two parts, before Christianity and after Christianity. Humanists, on the other hand, divided history into three parts: Antiquity, an age of moral and material superiority; the Middle Ages, a time of Gothic barbarity and decay; and the modern times, or the present, that according to the humanists ought to be formed on the principles of antiquity. This break in intellectual tradition came just in time. With urbanization, increased literacy, and the meritocratic system implemented by the new elites, how people saw themselves underwent radical change. Medieval society, with its structured and balanced ways, was by default collectivist. Man saw himself as member of a nation or a guild, native of a village or a town, one person among the many. Each man had his fixed position in society, with fixed responsibilities and fixed levels of knowledge and privilege. In northern Italy, on the other hand, traditional social bonds had already been broken down, and knowledge and position were available to anyone with the right abilities and the right means. This societal setup was naturally conducive to individualism, the me principle. The Great Plague that swept through Europe between 1348 and 1353 accelerated this process. Half or even more of the inhabitants of northern Italy died. This meant that those who survived had twice the property and double the employment prospects than before. As more and more peasants joined the middle classes, the towns and cities of northern Italy became more and more egalitarian. People's awareness of themselves as individuals became increasingly pronounced. With this flock of cats to govern, the position of despots and oligarchs became increasingly unsure. Competitiveness between the princes inevitably meant more sponsorship for the humanists. Of note here is Florence and the Medici. The Medici were upstarts who got rich by banking. Not having the stomach for war, they sought to outcompete the other city-states in terms of culture. As fate had it, the greatest minds of the Renaissance, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Donatello and Brunelleschi, were also born in or near Florence. Their immeasurable work, although inspired by antiquity, was far more than a mere copy. Proportions, perspectives, and standards of beauty were taken from antiquity and infused with the newly found confidence and individualism of the Renaissance. Great artists became superstars, whereas earlier they would have been considered mere artisans. Art in turn became worthy of itself and representative of reality and of man, whereas earlier it had mostly been an accessory to theology. Men became the subject of history, literature, architecture, and the fine arts, instead of being a mere object like before. While these lofty ideals of the Italians were circulating around Europe, more sober minds prevailed in the north. Northern humanists were understandably less concerned with the moral superiority of Greco-Roman antiquity. Instead, for them the antiquity to follow and replicate was that found in the Bible. Northern humanists are even more fascinated with languages and grammar. For Erasmus of Rotterdam and many other great minds, the primary goal of a humanist is to produce a more accurate translation of the Bible than the 5th century version used until then. While these intellectual pursuits are going on, the same social changes that happen in Italy and a similar shift in outlook and perspective occurs in Northern Europe. The obsession with the Bible, the newfound confidence of the middle classes, and the search for a personalized truth inevitably leads to the Protestant Reformation. But unlike the idealists in the South, Northern humanists are rather conservative. In their perspective, the decadent past is represented by the Church in Italy. Reformers like Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin want to replace this decadent past with a future that would be strictly based on the Bible, or rather, on their interpretation of the Bible. Due to the geopolitical reality of the Italian wars, Protestantism succeeds in the north, while Italy falls under the reactionary occupation of the Habsburgs. The Catholic Church draws inspiration from its Protestant enemy and becomes more puritanical and more conservative. With the Council of Trent, the Jesuits, the Roman Inquisition, and the Index of Forbidden Books, intellectual life becomes more restrictive. Nonetheless, by the 16th century, the Renaissance had already spread all over Europe. All aspects of life are touched by the Renaissance. Science is increasingly based on the scientific method, rather than on respect for the elders. As the Catholic Church becomes more conservative, scientists like Copernicus and Galileo get in trouble with the authorities. Nonetheless, with an expanding economy, the printing press, and a divided Europe, scientific progress becomes unstoppable. Art, the economy, the state, and the military become symbiotic with science. States become increasingly absolutist. Under the laws of feudalism, kings were first among equals, or primus inter pares. Now with the Renaissance, powerful monarchs like Francis I, Henry VIII, and Charles V choose to derive their power directly from God. Like northern Italian princes, they surround themselves with commoners who have a particular merit, while the traditional aristocracy becomes increasingly subservient. taxes become a professional matter of the state and internal customs are abolished. Kings become ever richer, fueling such titanic conflicts as the Italian Wars. If this wasn't enough, the Habsburgs' hand is additionally strengthened by the colonization of the Americas and the West Indies. The economy flourishes in these conditions, and capitalism is further refined in the Low Countries. The middle classes finally find their place within society, becoming the main economic engine and creditor of the absolutist monarchies. The triumph of the middle classes is best seen in Protestant countries. Calvin considered all work to be for the glory of God, and affluence as a sign of divine favor. Thus, individualism, Protestantism, and capitalism went hand in hand. Armies are also rationalized, and through trial and error, a universal European infantry fighting with pike and musket is introduced. Generalship becomes open to those with merit, and the chivalric ways of battle are all but extinguished. This is also the age of popular discontent manifesting in previously unthinkable ways. Peasant revolts find a convenient ideology in Protestantism, and the first instances of communism are seen. Although Europe becomes slightly freer, life for the most doesn't change in a fundamental way. Both the Catholic Church and the Protestants become increasingly repressive, and full religious and personal freedom will not be achieved for centuries. Nonetheless, the Renaissance had already inculcated the seed of the desire for knowledge and the search for individuality in the minds of European intelligentsia. The following centuries are a time full of optimism and self-confidence. Europe not only equals but far surpasses Greece and Rome. And all this unstoppable progress started 700 years ago, somewhere in northern Italy.